Two major European banks just got blacklisted by China. The EU is caught in a brutal trade war it never asked for. And the United States? It's tightening the leash. Welcome to the New World Order, where Europe has become a pawn in someone else's game. Opening. The trap tightens. Right now, Europe is standing at a crossroads it never wanted to face. On one side, there's the United States, its oldest ally, its security guarantor, and increasingly, its economic overseer. On the other side, there's China, the world's factory, a rising superpower, and a market Europe desperately needs but is being told to abandon. And somewhere in the middle? Europe is suffocating. This isn't just about diplomacy or trade policy. This is about survival. Europe is being squeezed from every direction, forced to make decisions that contradict its own economic interests, and the consequences are starting to show. Let's rewind for a moment. In recent years, the European Union has imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. It slapped duties on solar panels. It sanctioned Chinese banks for doing business with Russia. On paper, these moves look like Europe asserting its independence, standing up to authoritarian regimes, protecting its industries. But here's the problem. China isn't sitting quietly. Beijing just banned 2 European banks from operating on Chinese soil. Not massive institutions, not yet, but the message is unmistakable. This is a warning shot, and if Europe continues down this path, the retaliation will only get worse. Let's be blunt. Europe no longer controls its own foreign policy. For decades, the transatlantic alliance was built on mutual respect, shared values, and collective defense. But somewhere along the way, that partnership became asymmetric. The United States began calling the shots, and Europe started following orders, even when those orders directly harmed European interests. Take the situation with Russia. After the war in Ukraine began in 2022, the EU imposed sweeping sanctions on Moscow. They cut off imports of Russian natural gas, the lifeblood of German industry. They froze assets. They isolated Russian banks from the global financial system. And what happened? Russia adapted. It pivoted to China and India. Its economy, far from collapsing, found new footing. Oil revenues declined, yes, but other sectors expanded. Moscow started trading in yuan and rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely. Meanwhile, Europe paid the price. German factories, once powered by cheap Russian gas, now face energy bills 3 times higher than their American competitors. Households across the continent are struggling with inflation that hasn't let up. And for what? Russia is still standing. The war continues, and Europe has lost one of its most reliable energy suppliers, permanently. But here's the kicker. The United States didn't just ask Europe to sanction Russia. It demanded Europe cut ties with China, too. Italy's dilemma, a case study in submission. Let's zoom in on Italy for a moment, because it perfectly illustrates the impossible position Europe finds itself in. Italy has significant Chinese investment in its economy. One of the most famous examples? Pirelli, the iconic tire manufacturer. More than a third of Pirelli is owned by Chinese investors. You'd think that would help the company access Chinese markets, right? Boost exports, create jobs, strengthen Italy's industrial base. Wrong. Because of American national security concerns, Pirelli is now facing restrictions. The company can't easily supply certain Formula One teams. It's being scrutinized for potential risks simply because it has Chinese backing. The implication is clear. Any European company with Chinese ties is now seen as a potential threat, not by Europe, but by Washington. And it's not just Pirelli. Italian energy companies are being blocked from participating in U.S. projects because of their Chinese connections. These are profitable contracts, strategic partnerships, opportunities that could strengthen Italy's economy, but they're off the table because the United States says so. Now, Italy's government is actively reducing Chinese investments in strategic sectors. They're limiting access to Chinese technology, Chinese capital, Chinese markets. And why? Not because it's in Italy's interest, but because they're terrified of how Washington will react if they don't. This is the reality across Europe. Fear of American retaliation is driving policy more than national interest. The China problem. Dependency dressed as danger. Let's talk about China. Since 2022, German exports to China have fallen sharply. Why? Well, because Chinese companies have gotten better. They're now producing their own auto parts, their own machinery, their own industrial equipment. They just don't need to buy as much from Europe anymore. Meanwhile, European goods have become more expensive and less competitive. Tariffs, sanctions, and political tensions have all contributed to this decline. But here's the irony. Europe still depends on China, heavily. European manufacturers rely on Chinese components to keep costs down. Rare earth elements, semiconductors, industrial chemicals, pharmaceuticals, these are not optional, they are essential. And China controls much of the global supply. So, Europe is stuck. It's trying to sell high-end products to the United States while importing critical materials from China. It's a balancing act that's becoming harder by the day. And the numbers don't lie. The EU's trade deficit with China has more than doubled since 2020. Europe is importing far more than it's exporting. Tariffs haven't changed that. In fact, they've made things worse, because European companies still need those Chinese imports. They just cost more now. At the same time, Europe has cut itself off from Russian energy, and those resources have largely flowed to China instead. So, Beijing is getting cheaper energy, while Europe is paying premium prices for liquefied natural gas shipped from halfway around the world. This isn't strategy. This is economic self-sabotage. The BRICS factor. A new power block emerges. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has expanded. More countries are joining. More nations are looking for alternatives to the Western-dominated global order. And the United States is deeply concerned. Why? Because BRICS represents a direct challenge to American economic hegemony. These countries are trading in their own currencies. They're building alternative financial systems. They're creating supply chains that bypass the West entirely, and they're doing it successfully. The U.S. response? Pressure Europe to isolate BRICS. Washington wants the EU to impose steep tariffs on China and India. It wants Europe to stop buying Russian oil, even if it comes through third parties. It wants Europe to cut economic ties with the global South and align fully with American interests. But here's the problem. Europe can't afford to do that. Over 23% of EU trade involves BRICS nations. Compare that to the United States, where only 16.7% of trade involves BRICS. Europe is far more dependent on these countries than America is, and it gets worse. BRICS nations have diversified. Less than 15% of their exports go to Europe. Less than 10% go to the United States. They've built trade relationships across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. They're not economically dependent on the West anymore. So what happens if Europe follows America's lead and tries to isolate BRICS? Retaliation. Swift and severe. China could restrict exports of rare earth elements. India could impose counter tariffs. Supply chains could be rerouted away from Europe entirely. And European industries, already struggling, would face shortages, rising costs, and collapsing demand. In simple terms, Europe needs BRICS far more than BRICS needs Europe. The semiconductor gambit, America's high-stakes bet. Meanwhile, the United States is making its own bold and risky moves. Washington is pushing to dominate the global semiconductor industry. The latest proposal? Increase tariffs on imported chips from 100% to 300%. The goal is clear force companies like TSMC, Samsung, SK Hynix, ASML, and Tokyo Electron to move production to American soil. But there's a massive problem. Building semiconductor fabrication plants, known as fabs, is incredibly expensive, time-consuming, and technically complex. A single fab can cost tens of billions of dollars and take years to construct. Even after construction, calibration takes months, and operating costs in the United States are significantly higher than in Asia due to labor, regulation, and infrastructure. So even if companies agree to relocate, the chips produced in America will be more expensive and less competitive than those made in Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan. And what if companies refuse to move? Then American businesses, from AI startups to defense contractors to biotech firms, will face skyrocketing costs and supply shortages. Industries that rely on cutting-edge semiconductors will be crippled. Oh, and there's one more thing. China controls most of the world's rare earth elements, which are critical for semiconductor manufacturing. If Beijing decides to restrict exports in retaliation, the entire American strategy collapses. Meanwhile, China isn't standing still. Over the past decade, it has massively increased investment in research and development. Chinese chip manufacturers are producing viable alternatives to Western technology. The gap is closing, so the United States is betting everything on a strategy that may not work, and asking Europe to do the same. The human cost, citizens pay the price. Let's not forget who bears the brunt of all this. Ordinary Europeans. Wages have stagnated. Inflation persists. Energy costs remain unstable. Household budgets are stretched thin, and the economic uncertainty shows no sign of easing. Meanwhile, European industries are struggling to maintain competitiveness. Growth is slowing, supply chains are disrupted, and the political class seems more concerned with pleasing Washington than addressing these problems. American households are struggling too, drowning in debt and rising costs. But Europe's situation is arguably worse because European governments have less fiscal flexibility and fewer natural resources to fall back on. This isn't abstract economics. This is people's lives. The fork in the road: adapt or resist. So where does this leave us? Europe, and to a lesser extent, the United States, faces a fundamental choice. Option 1. Adapt. Recognize that the world has changed. Accept that economic power is shifting eastward and southward. Work with emerging powers like China, India, and BRICS nations to reshape trade relationships, build new partnerships, and maintain influence in a multipolar world. This doesn't mean abandoning values or security concerns. It means being pragmatic. It means pursuing strategic autonomy instead of blind alignment. Option 2. Resist. Double down on tariffs, sanctions, and coercive measures. Try to isolate competitors. Attempt to force the world back into a Western-dominated order. But here's the thing about resistance. It comes at a cost. Trying to fight these global shifts without accounting for economic interdependence is like tearing down the walls of your own house to build a fence. You might feel safer for a moment, but eventually the roof collapses. Closing. The price of isolation. The stakes couldn't be higher. Europe is being asked to sacrifice its economic future to serve someone else's geopolitical agenda. It's being told to cut ties with the very countries that supply its industries, power its factories, and buy its goods. And for what? To maintain an alliance with a partner that increasingly treats it not as an equal, but as a subordinate. The United States, meanwhile, is pursuing a strategy of dominance that may backfire spectacularly. It's trying to reshape global trade, control critical industries, and isolate rivals, all while lacking the resources, industrial capacity, and time to pull it off smoothly. The old rules of globalization are being rewritten. Alliances are shifting. Power is redistributing. And both Europe and America face a brutal truth: adapt to this new reality, or risk becoming isolated in a world that's moving forward without them. The question isn't whether the global order is changing. It is. The question is whether the West will find a way to remain relevant, or whether it will build walls so high that it traps itself inside, alone, diminished, and increasingly irrelevant in a world it once led. That's the choice, and the clock is ticking.